She entered the bank building cautiously, as if afraid to leave marks on the polished marble floor. The automatic doors slid apart silently, and a wave of cool, conditioned air brushed her face. For a moment she stopped, tightly clutching a worn envelope with documents. Everything here felt custom. The high ceilings, the mirrored walls, the people in expensive suits who spoke softly yet confidently, as if the world belonged to them by default. She straightened her simple coat and took a step forward. Her mother had worked in this bank for almost 20 years. At night, when the employees left, she washed the floors, wiped glass partitions, and emptied trash bins. During the day, no one remembered her, and if they did notice her, they looked right through her. The girl remembered how her mother would return home near dawn, exhausted, her hands smelling of cleaning chemicals, yet her face always calm. She never complained. "The main thing is to do your job honestly," she used to say while making cheap tea in their tiny kitchen. Now her mother was gone. All that remained was a strange notice from a notary and a number of a bank safe deposit box she had never heard of before. When she approached the counter, a young clerk with a flawless smile politely asked about the purpose of her visit. The girl spoke quietly and handed over the documents. The smile wavered for a split second, eyebrows lifting slightly, but the clerk quickly regained her composure and took the papers. After a brief glance, the clerk excused herself and disappeared behind a glass door. The girl stood there, feeling dozens of curious, indifferent, and slightly annoyed glances on her back. She could almost hear the unspoken questions. What was someone like her doing in a place like this? She tried not to fidget, repeating to herself that she had every right to be here. A few minutes later, the clerk returned, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit. He was the banker, one of the senior managers. His confident stride slowed when he looked at the girl from head to toe. A barely noticeable smile curled his lips, one that held more amusement than kindness. "So," he said, glancing at the papers, "you're here regarding a safe deposit box." "Yes," the girl replied, meeting his gaze. "It belonged to my mother." The banker raised an eyebrow. "Your mother," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "May I ask what she did?" "She worked here," the girl answered simply. "She was a cleaner." A short laugh escaped him, light and dismissive. He didn't even try to hide it. "A cleaner," he echoed. "And she had a personal safe deposit box." He shook his head slightly, amused. "Well, miracles do happen." The girl felt heat rush to her face, but she remained silent. She had expected this. People had always underestimated her mother, and now they were doing the same to her. "Everything seems to be in order," the banker finally said, though his tone suggested he still didn't quite believe it. "If you'll follow me, we'll check the contents of the box." They walked through long corridors into the restricted area. The walls grew thicker, the doors heavier, security tighter. Each step made the girl's heart beat faster. She didn't know what to expect. Perhaps old letters. Maybe a few savings. She certainly wasn't expecting anything extraordinary. The banker entered the code, turned the key, and slid the metal box out. With a theatrical pause, he placed it on the table and nodded toward her. "Go ahead." Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of cash, bound with bank straps. For a second, her mind refused to process what she was seeing. Then she noticed small velvet cases containing jewelry, their stones catching the cold light. Beneath them lay a thick folder of documents. The banker froze. The smile vanished from his face. He leaned closer, disbelief written clearly in his eyes. This can't be right," he muttered. The girl carefully took out the folder. Inside were certificates, contracts, and official confirmations. Large deposits, shares, long-term investments. Everything was legal, properly oformlano, and unmistakably real. At the very bottom lay a handwritten letter. She unfolded it slowly, recognizing her mother's neat, careful handwriting. The letter explained everything. Years ago, late at night, her mother had found a man collapsed near the bank's service entrance. He had suffered a heart attack. While others might have ignored him, she called an ambulance, stayed by his side, and quite literally saved his life. That man turned out to be one of the bank's founders. Out of gratitude, he insisted on rewarding her. She refused publicity, refused attention, but eventually agreed to accept financial security for her daughter's future. On one condition: Absolute secrecy. She continued working as a cleaner, never changing her lifestyle, never telling anyone. The banker sank into the chair opposite her, his face pale. He recognized the name instantly. The story was true. He remembered hearing whispers about the founder's mysterious benefactor, but no one ever knew who it was. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. The arrogance in his voice was gone. "I judged too quickly." The girl folded the letter and placed it back into the box. "My mother said people are often blind to what doesn't fit their expectations," she replied calmly. He nodded, unable to argue. "If you'd like," he said carefully, "the bank can offer full assistance in managing these assets. Personal advisors. Preferential conditions." She considered his words for a moment, then closed the box. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think about it." As she left the bank, her steps were steady. The same marble floor, the same glass walls, but she felt different now. Not because of the money, but because she knew the truth. Dignity, kindness, and quiet strength were worth far more than any fortune. Behind her, in the silent vault, the banker remained seated, staring at the closed safe deposit box, haunted by the realization that he had laughed at a legacy built not on wealth, but on humanity. She entered the bank slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the building itself might reject her presence. The glass doors opened with a soft mechanical sigh, and a breath of chilled air washed over her face. The marble floor beneath her worn shoes gleamed like a mirror, reflecting the tall columns, the gold-lettered signs, and the confident silhouettes of people who seemed born to belong here. For a brief moment, she considered turning around. But then she tightened her grip on the old brown envelope in her hands and forced herself to move forward. This place was not unfamiliar to her, at least not entirely. As a child, she had waited outside these very walls countless times, sitting on the low concrete steps late at night, wrapped in a thin jacket, while her mother worked inside. She remembered how the lights would glow long after sunset, how the city would grow quiet while the bank remained awake, guarded and spotless. Back then, the building had seemed enormous and intimidating. Now, standing inside it, she felt that same smallness pressing down on her chest. Her mother had worked here for nearly 20 years. Not as a clerk, not as a manager, not as someone whose name appeared on plaques or documents. She was a cleaner. She arrived when everyone else left and departed before the first employees returned. She scrubbed floors that others walked across without a second thought, wiped fingerprints from glass walls, polished door handles, and emptied trash. Bins filled with the remnants of important meetings. People rarely greeted her. Most didn't even look at her. Yet at home, her mother was different. Calm, thoughtful, quietly strong. She would come back at dawn, her back aching, her hands rough from chemicals, but her eyes steady. She would cook a simple breakfast, wake her daughter gently, and ask about school. "Never think your work defines your worth," she often said. "What matters is how you treat people when no one is watching." When her mother died, the world seemed to lose its balance. There was no dramatic illness, no long farewell, just a sudden heart failure that took her quietly in her sleep. The girl was left alone in their small apartment with silence, memories, and unanswered questions. She expected nothing more than grief and struggle. Certainly not a letter from a notary. The letter had arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. Formal language. Official stamps. A brief notice informing her that she was the sole heir to the contents of a safe deposit box held at the very bank where her mother had worked. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Her mother barely had savings. They had lived modestly their entire lives. A bank safe deposit box sounded absurd. And yet, here she was. She approached the reception desk, where a young woman with flawless makeup and a perfectly tailored uniform looked up and smiled automatically. "How may I help you?" the clerk asked. The girl swallowed and explained her situation, her voice barely above a whisper. She slid the envelope across the counter. The clerk opened it, scanned the documents, and her expression changed. Just slightly, but enough to be noticed. Curiosity flickered in her eyes, followed by confusion. "One moment, please," the clerk said politely, gathering the papers and standing up. The girl waited. She could feel eyes on her. Quick glances, subtle judgments. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, resisting the urge to smooth her hair or hide her hands. She reminded herself that she had every right to be there. Several minutes passed before the clerk returned, this time accompanied by a man in his late 40s wearing an expensive suit and an air of authority. His steps were measured, confident. This was not someone accustomed to doubt. "I'm the bank's senior manager," he said, taking the documents and glancing at them briefly. His gaze then moved to the girl, assessing her clothes, her posture, her face. A faint smile appeared on his lips, one that held more amusement than warmth. "You're here about a safe deposit box?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "It belonged to my mother." He looked back down at the papers. "And your mother was?" he prompted. "She worked here," the girl said. "As a cleaner." For a second, there was silence. Then the banker chuckled softly, shaking his head as if he had just heard an entertaining anecdote. "I see," he said. "Well, that's certainly unusual." The girl felt a familiar sting of humiliation, but she kept her face neutral. She had seen this reaction before. In teachers, in neighbors, in strangers who learned what her mother did for a living. "Everything appears to be in order," the banker continued, though his tone suggested skepticism. "If you'll follow me, we can proceed." They walked through secured doors into the restricted areas of the bank. The further they went, the quieter it became. The air felt heavier, cooler. The girl's heartbeat echoed in her ears. She wondered again what she would find. Old photographs, letters, perhaps a few documents she wouldn't understand. They stopped in front of a thick metal door. The banker entered a code, turned a key, and gestured for her to step inside. He retrieved a metal box from a row of identical compartments and placed it on a table. Between them. "You may open it," he said, leaning back slightly, his expression still carrying a trace of disbelief. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. For a moment, her mind refused to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. Neatly stacked bundles of cash filled most of the box, secured with official bank bands. Beneath them were small cases containing jewelry, rings, necklaces, watches, each piece understated yet unmistakably valuable. At the bottom lay a thick folder of documents. The banker leaned forward abruptly. His smile vanished. "This must be some kind of error," he murmured. The girl reached for the folder and opened it carefully. Inside were certificates, account statements, share documents, and legal confirmations. Everything bore official seals. The sums mentioned made her dizzy. At the very end of the folder, she found a folded sheet of paper. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her mother's letter was calm, deliberate, written in the same careful script she used for grocery lists and school notes. It explained that years ago, late one winter night, she had found a man collapsed near the service entrance of the bank. He had suffered a severe heart attack. She had called an ambulance, stayed with him, and insisted the security staff not move him until help arrived. That man survived. He was one of the bank's founders. Out of gratitude, he had offered her money, publicity, connections, things she refused. Eventually, they reached an agreement. He would ensure financial security for her daughter's future, and she would keep the matter completely confidential. She continued working as a cleaner, living the same modest life, believing that dignity mattered more than recognition. The girl finished reading and looked up. The banker had gone pale. He stared at the documents as if they had rewritten everything he thought he knew. "I remember this story," he said quietly. "The founder mentioned someone who saved his life, but no one ever knew who it was." He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology. I judged you, and your mother, unfairly." The girl folded the letter and placed it back into the box. "My mother always said that people see only what they expect to see," she replied softly. The banker nodded, visibly humbled. "We can offer you full assistance," he said. "Advisors, legal support, anything you need." "Thank you," she said after a pause. "I'll consider it." When she left the bank, the sunlight outside felt warmer than before. The building behind her looked the same, but she no longer felt small. She walked away not just with an inheritance, but with the quiet certainty that her mother's life, so easily overlooked, had mattered more than anyone there had ever imagined. She entered the bank slowly, almost as if she were stepping into a place that did not belong to her. The glass doors opened with a soft mechanical sound, releasing a wave of cool, conditioned air that contrasted sharply with the warmth of the street outside. The marble floor beneath her feet shone so brightly that she could see her own reflection, slightly distorted, uncertain. For a moment, She hesitated, clutching the worn brown envelope closer to her chest, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. People moved around her with purpose and confidence. Men in tailored suits spoke quietly into phones, women with perfect hairstyles tapped on tablets, their heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. No one noticed her, and at the same time, she felt as though everyone could see her. Her simple clothes, her cautious steps, her unease. She took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here. This bank had been a part of her life long before she ever imagined walking into it during the day. As a child, she had waited for her mother outside this very building countless times. Late at night, wrapped in a thin jacket, she would sit on the cold concrete steps while her mother cleaned inside. She remembered watching the lights glow behind the tall windows, wondering what kind of people worked there, what kind of lives they lived. To her, the bank had always seemed like a fortress, solid, distant, untouchable. Her mother had worked here for almost 20 years. Not in an office, not behind a desk, but after everyone else had gone home. She scrubbed floors until they shone, wiped fingerprints from glass walls, polished metal railings, and emptied bins full of discarded documents and half-finished cups of coffee. Most people never looked at her. Some barely acknowledged her existence at all. At home, though, her mother was someone else entirely. She was quiet but wise, tired but patient. She would return near dawn, smelling of cleaning products, her hands rough and cracked, her back aching. Yet she always found the strength to smile, to make breakfast, to ask about school. Never be ashamed of honest work, she used to say. And never think kindness goes unnoticed, even if it feels that way. When her mother died, the world seemed to collapse into silence. There was no long illness, no dramatic goodbye, just a sudden heart failure that took her in her sleep. One night her mother was there, and the next morning she was gone. The girl was left alone in their small apartment, surrounded by familiar objects that now felt painfully empty. She mourned not only her mother, but the life they had shared, simple and fragile. She expected hardship. She expected to struggle. What she did not expect was a letter from a notary. The letter arrived 2 weeks after the funeral, printed on thick paper, filled with formal language and official stamps. It informed her that she was the sole heir to the contents of a safe deposit box held at the bank where her mother had worked. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Her mother had no savings worth mentioning. They lived from paycheck to paycheck. A safe deposit box sounded like something from another world. She read the letter again and again, searching for an explanation. There was none. Only a box number, a bank name, and instructions to appear in person with identification. Confused and uneasy, she decided to go. If nothing else, she would confirm the error and put the matter to rest. Now she stood inside the bank, years of memories pressing down on her. She approached the reception desk slowly. The young clerk behind it looked up with a professional smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "How may I help you?" the clerk asked. The girl cleared her throat and explained why she was there. Her voice trembled slightly as she handed over the envelope. The clerk took the documents and began to read. As her eyes scanned the text, her expression changed, just a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by politeness. "One moment, please," the clerk said, standing up and taking the papers with her. The girl waited. Time seemed to stretch. She could feel curious glances brushing against her like cold air. She imagined what they were thinking. Why was someone like her here? She straightened her shoulders, reminding herself of her mother's words. Honest work, dignity, kindness. Several minutes later, the clerk returned with a man who clearly did not need an introduction. He wore an expensive suit, his hair neatly styled, his posture confident. His presence alone seemed to command attention. This was a banker, someone accustomed to authority, to wealth, to being obeyed. "I'm the senior manager," he said, taking the documents and glancing at them briefly. His eyes then moved to her, assessing her from head to toe. A faint, amused smile touched his lips. "You're here regarding a safe deposit box?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "It belonged to my mother." He looked back at the papers. "And your mother was?" he asked, trailing off. "She worked here," the girl said quietly. "She was a cleaner." The banker let out a short laugh, shaking his head slightly. "A cleaner," he repeated. "With a safe deposit box." He seemed genuinely entertained. "Well, that's something you don't see every day." The words stung, but the girl said nothing. She had grown up with this kind of reaction. People often underestimated her mother. They assumed her life was small because her job was. "Everything appears to be in order," the banker said at last. "If you'll follow me, we'll proceed." They walked through secured doors into the restricted areas of the bank. Each door closed behind them with a heavy, final sound. The corridors grew quieter, the walls thicker. The girl's heart pounded as they descended deeper into the building. She wondered again what she might find. Perhaps old documents. Maybe letters her mother never had the chance to share. They stopped in front of a massive metal door. The banker entered a code, turned a key, and pulled the door open. Inside was the vault. Rows upon rows of identical metal boxes, each holding someone's secrets. He removed one box and placed it on a table. "You may open it," he said, leaning back slightly, his expression still tinged with disbelief. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid. For a moment, her mind simply refused to understand what she was seeing. Bundles of cash lay neatly stacked inside, secured with official bank bands. Beneath them were small cases containing jewelry, simple in design, but clearly valuable. At the bottom lay a thick folder of documents. The banker stepped closer, his breath catching. This can't be right," he murmured. The girl reached for the folder and opened it slowly. Inside were account statements, certificates, share documents, and legal confirmations. Everything bore official seals. The numbers were overwhelming. This was not a small savings. This was a fortune. At the very end of the folder, she found a folded letter. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Her mother's neat, careful script. The letter explained everything. Years ago, on a cold winter night, her mother had found a man collapsed near the bank's service entrance. He had suffered a severe heart attack. She had not hesitated. She called an ambulance, stayed with him, and insisted that security staff follow medical instructions until help arrived. That man survived. He was one of the bank's founders. Grateful beyond words, he had tried to reward her publicly. She refused. She did not want attention, praise, or a different life. Eventually, they agreed on a quiet solution. He would ensure financial security for her daughter's future. In return, she would keep the matter secret and continue living as she always had. The girl finished reading, her eyes blurred with tears. She looked up to see the banker sitting heavily in a chair, his face pale. "I've heard this story," he said softly. "But I never knew who it was." He looked at her with something like respect. "I'm sorry," he added. "I judged too quickly." The girl folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. "My mother believed that kindness mattered more than recognition," she said. The banker nodded. "The bank will offer full support," he said. "Anything you need." "Thank you," she replied calmly. "I'll decide later." When she left the bank, the sunlight outside felt warmer, brighter. The building behind her no longer seemed intimidating. She walked away carrying not just an inheritance, but the quiet truth that her mother's simple life had held extraordinary value, far beyond what anyone had ever imagined. She entered the bank slowly, as though stepping into a world that had never been meant for her. The glass doors parted with a soft, indifferent hiss, and a wave of cold air washed over her face. The contrast made her shiver. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished marble floors, tall columns, glass walls that reflected light and movement from every angle. People crossed the hall with confident strides, their voices low, their gestures precise. It felt like a place built on certainty, where doubt had no right to exist. She tightened her grip on the worn brown envelope she carried. Its edges were frayed, the paper softened by time and nervous fingers. It was the only thing she trusted at that moment. For a brief second, she considered turning around, slipping back into the street, into a life where nothing so strange and overwhelming ever happened. But then she remembered her mother's face, calm even in exhaustion, and forced herself to move forward. This bank had always been a silent presence in her life. As a child, she knew it not by its grand interior but by its back entrance, the one used by night staff. Many evenings, she had sat outside on the cold concrete steps, swinging her legs and watching shadows move behind the tall windows while her mother worked inside. Sometimes she would fall asleep there, her head resting against her mother's worn coat when she finally came out near dawn. The building had seemed enormous then, like a fortress guarding secrets far beyond her understanding. Her mother had worked here for nearly 20 years. Not as someone whose name appeared on doors or documents, but as someone whose absence would only be noticed if the floors were dirty or the glass smudged. She came when everyone else left. She cleaned offices filled with important conversations, wiped desks where contracts were signed, emptied trash bins filled with discarded drafts and half-drunk coffee cups. People rarely greeted her. Most didn't see her at all. At home, though, her mother was fully visible. She was quiet, thoughtful, and strong in a way that didn't demand attention. She would come home smelling of cleaning chemicals, her hands rough and cracked, her shoulders stiff with fatigue. Yet she always found the strength to smile, to ask about school, to listen. They lived modestly, counting every expense, but there was a sense of peace in their small apartment. Never be ashamed of honest work, her mother often said. And never think that kindness disappears just because no one applauds it. Those words echoed in her mind now. Her mother's death had come suddenly. One evening they had eaten dinner together, talking about nothing important. That night, her mother went to bed as usual. In the morning, she didn't wake up. The doctor said it was her heart. Quick, painless. The girl felt as though the ground had vanished beneath her feet. The world became unbearably quiet. She expected grief. She expected struggle. She expected to be alone. What she did not expect was the letter. It arrived 2 weeks after the funeral, placed neatly among bills and advertisements. The envelope was heavy, official. Inside was a letter from a notary, written in precise, impersonal language. It informed her that she was the sole heir to the contents of a safe deposit box held at the bank where her mother had worked. She read it again and again, certain there was a mistake. Her mother had no savings worth mentioning. They lived from paycheck to paycheck. A safe deposit box sounded like something from a different life entirely. And yet the letter was real. It named the bank, listed a box number, and requested her presence with identification. Confused and uneasy, she finally decided to go. If it was an error, she would clear it up. If it wasn't, she didn't even know what that would mean. Now she stood in the vast lobby, feeling smaller with every step. She approached the reception desk where a young woman with flawless makeup and a perfectly pressed uniform looked up and smiled automatically. "How may I help you?" the clerk asked. The girl explained why she was there, her voice quiet but steady. She handed over the envelope and her documents. The clerk took them, her eyes scanning the text. For a moment, her professional expression faltered, just a flicker of surprise, before she masked it again. "One moment, please," the clerk said politely, standing and walking away with the papers. The girl waited. Time stretched painfully. She could feel eyes on her. Brief, curious glances, quickly dismissed. She imagined the unspoken questions. Why was she here? Did she belong? She straightened her shoulders and focused on breathing. After several minutes, the clerk returned, this time accompanied by a man whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere. He wore an expensive suit, his hair carefully styled, his posture confident and practiced. This was someone used to authority. "I'm the senior manager," he said, taking the documents from the clerk and glancing at them. Then he looked at the girl, his gaze moving over her clothes, her posture, her face. A faint smile appeared on his lips, not unkind but unmistakably amused. "You're here regarding a safe deposit box?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "It belonged to my mother." He nodded slowly. "And your mother was?" he prompted. "She worked here," the girl said. "She was a cleaner." The banker let out a short laugh, shaking his head slightly. "A cleaner," he repeated. "With a safe deposit box." He smiled as if at a curious joke. "Well, that's certainly unusual." The word stung, but the girl remained silent. She had heard variations of that tone all her life. "Everything appears to be in order," the banker said finally. "If you'll follow me, we'll take care of it." They passed through secure doors into areas the girl had never seen before. The corridors were quiet, the walls thick, the air cooler. Each door closed behind them with a heavy, final sound. Her heart pounded with every step. She wondered again what she would find. Old letters. Perhaps documents she wouldn't understand. They stopped in front of a massive metal door. The banker entered a code, turned a key, and opened it. Inside was the vault. Rows upon rows of identical metal boxes, each holding someone's secrets. He removed one box and placed it on a table. "You may open it," he said, leaning back slightly, his expression still tinged with skepticism. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. For a moment, her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Neatly stacked bundles of cash filled most of the box, secured with official bank bands. Beneath them were small cases containing jewelry, simple, elegant pieces that clearly held significant value. At the bottom lay a thick folder of documents. The banker stepped closer, his breath catching. The smile vanished from his face. This can't be right," he murmured. The girl reached for the folder and opened it carefully. Inside were account statements, certificates, investment records, and legal confirmations. Everything bore official seals. The numbers were overwhelming. This was not a modest savings. This was a fortune. At the very end of the folder lay a folded letter. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Her mother's. She unfolded it slowly, her heart aching as the familiar, careful script filled her vision. The letter explained everything. Years ago, on a cold winter night, her mother had found a man collapsed near the bank's service entrance. He had suffered a severe heart attack. Most people would have panicked or walked away, assuming it wasn't their problem. Her mother hadn't hesitated. She called an ambulance, stayed with him, followed the dispatcher's instructions, and refused to leave his side until help arrived. The man survived. He was one of the founders of the bank. Grateful beyond words, he had tried to reward her publicly. She refused. She didn't want attention or praise. She didn't want her life to change. Eventually, they reached a quiet agreement. He would ensure financial security for her daughter's future, and she would keep the matter completely confidential. She continued working as a cleaner, living the same modest life, believing that dignity mattered more than recognition. The girl finished reading, tears blurring her vision. She looked up to see the banker sitting heavily in a chair, his face pale. "I've heard this story," he said quietly. "But no one ever knew who saved him." He looked at her with something close to reverence. "I owe you an apology. I judged too quickly." The girl folded the letter and placed it back into the box. "My mother believed that kindness didn't need witnesses," she said softly. The banker nodded. "The bank will offer you full support," he said. "Advisors, legal assistance, anything you need." "Thank you," she replied. "I'll decide in my own time." When she left the bank, the sunlight felt warmer than before. The building behind her looked the same, but she felt different. She walked away carrying not just an inheritance, but the quiet certainty that her mother's simple life had held extraordinary meaning, far beyond what anyone had ever imagined.